How did warfare change between 1250 to 1500? Now, this video focuses on two key questions really. How did the nature of warfare change and stay the same between 1250 to 1500? And how did the experience of warfare change and stay the same in the same period? So what wars were fought between 1250 and 1500? Well, actually, war was almost constant for the English people in this period. There were wars between the kings of England and Wales and Scotland, as Wales and Scotland tried to fight for control of their own countries. The Hundred Years' War to try and gain land in France between 1337 and 1453, as the kings of England had a claim to the French land and wanted to claim it for themselves. And the Wars of the Roses, 1455 to 1485, weakened by the 100 Years' War. There was a battle for control of the English throne between the House of York and the House of Lancaster. So there's clearly a great deal of war in this period, and these wars resulted in a great deal of change. However, there are certain aspects which remained the same throughout. Firstly, the size of the army stayed the same. There were 10,000 troops on the size of Henry III at the Battle of Lewes in 1264. In 1415, at Agincourt, Henry V's army was about 8,000, and the Battle of Bosworth, Richard III's army was about 12,000, showing that the size of the armies did not vary too greatly. Military strategy largely remained similar in two key areas. First of all, in the area of limited warfare. For example, during the 100 Years' War, the English armies carried out dozens of chevauchées, which were short raids on horseback with smaller armies of 2,000 to 3,000 men designed to disrupt the French supply trains and intimidate the French people. Also, the kings captured and built castles to control areas. In the 1200s, Edward I built castles in Wales to help control his land there, and in the 100 Years' War, Henry V captured French castles at Harfleur and other French towns to control Normandy. Lastly, another area of continuity was in the command of armies, which was still run by the nobility. So Edward I used the Earl of Surrey as a senior commander at the Battle of Falkirk in 1298, and at Agincourt the Duke of York was his senior commander for Henry V. Major changes. First of all was the use of pikemen, which were used to minimise the impact of cavalry, particularly the schiltrons used by the Scottish. Pikes were wooden poles which could be used by infantry to thrust at their enemy with a sharp spear on the end. What happened was that the pikemen were trained to develop into these schiltrons, which was a natural defensive formation with layers of pikes to prevent cavalry being able to breach the line. Also, pikemen were trained to be more aggressive and move forward as an attacking strategy as well as being mostly defensive. And at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, the schiltrons used by the Scots were able to defeat the British and their cavalry. So pikes were a very important development at this time. Just as important was the use of longbows by the English. Now, longbows were very useful because they had a very quick rate of fire. A longbow archer could shoot 10 to 15 arrows per minute, much more than the 2 to 3 bolts a crossbow could fire. A longbow was effective up to 200 metres, twice the range of shorter bows, and they were very powerful. The arrows were a metre long, could pierce armour, meaning that the English could use the longbow to great effect, particularly at the Battle of Falkirk, where they used them to defeat the Scots, and more famously at Agincourt, where the longbowmen defeated the superior French army. And so the longbows became a key weapon for the English. And actually this is about both individuals, as it was Edward I who had made the English army start to use the longbows to greater effect, but also technology, as this more powerful longbow had been developed and was very effective. Partly because of this, the composition of the armies changed, as there was less need for cavalry, meant that there was more infantry and particularly more archers in the army. And lastly, armour changed. The traditional chain mail was great for defending against slashing swords, but was less good against arrows, and so this was changed and more people started to wear plate armour. Gunpowder is another example of where science and technology was starting to change warfare. However, it's not greatly used in the English armies, and it had come over from China and was known of, but was not used to great effect at this time. From 1320, cannon were used in battle, but were heavy and could only fire 100 yards, so little impact. And actually, it was often thought that it was the sound and the kind of fear created by that was the biggest impact to them at this time. In 1415, Henry V had used 12 cannons to try and defeat the castle at Harfleur, but after 5 weeks it could not penetrate the walls. However, from 1430, improving technology meant cannons became a lot more effective. As more metal was used, designs were improved. It meant that they were used in battle sometimes, but often in sieges the cannons would be used to try and defeat the enemy and break down their defences. You also start to see, from the 1400s, firearms being developed like the arquebus. These were no match to the English longbow and were sometimes dangerous and difficult to reload and heavy. However, this is clearly an important development for the future of warfare, that gunpowder and firearms were starting to be used at this time. Change in the nature of warfare was to do with the decline of the mounted knight. Now, knights were always the elite force of the army and made up a large part of it. It was a key tactic to have your knights punch through the enemy lines and scatter them, and also its social and military leaders came from the knights. However, from 1290 onwards, the role of the knights was limited by the success initially of the longbow, and later firearms and cannon, and also the pike through the schildtrons in minimising their impact. So new technology and tactics led to the demise of the mounted knight as the elite part of the army. However, cavalry was still used, but just the role changed. They took up scouting and raiding roles and were often dismounted to fight with the infantry in battle. And actually, at this point, sometimes the whole army would be on horseback with archers and infantry riding to a battle and then getting into formation. And then when the enemy fled, often the cavalry would then remount to chase them down and slaughter them. So what happened as well was that this led to armies having less cavalry, going from a ratio of 1 to 3 or 1 to 2 to, by Agincourt, the ratio averaged about 1 to 10. And actually, less and less nobility signed up to fight. In 1250, about 30% of the English cavalry for nobility, but as more and more nobility paid scutage instead of fighting, only 5% of cavalry were nobles for the English campaigns in France in the 100 Years' War. And actually, more and more mercenaries were employed as mounted men-at-arms. Of warfare, there were changes in the way men were recruited to the army. Now, feudal troops, both nobles, knights and infantry, were used less and less. Now, this is because the feudal troops only gave limited time and support, and often they were poorly trained, so actually they were becoming less and less useful. The king had to rely more and more on the assize of arms to compel troops to fight for him. The assize of arms was an order that all men between 16 to 60 would have to muster once a year to show that they were able to fight, and would be used for up to 40 days to fight for the king in his campaigns. However, even with this, increasingly the king had to rely on paid troops, either through the royal household, a regular army that the king kept at all times, or mercenaries who were recruited for a period of time. And the king's agents would contract a mercenary in an indenture with a captain who could provide a group of mercenaries to fight for the king. An impact on the training of the men. Now, feudal troops were only summoned for war, so there was very, very little training beyond tournaments for knights who were not trained to fight in groups, and the feudal infantry were given almost no training whatsoever. The assays of arms actually meant the king's commissioner mustered local men once a year and could ensure that, first of all, the men had good quality weapons, but also practicing with them and could fight. This was aided by the fact that in 1285, Edward I made archery targets be set up in every town, and in 1363, Edward III ordered that there should be archery practice on all feast days and holidays, ensuring that the English people were very good with their longbows. Paid troops were, however, well trained and inspected regularly through musters. A trained archer would be trained by someone called a centinel, who would have 100 men who could fire volleys of arrows into targets at once. The constant nature of war at this time, provisioning became more and more important. There was wars almost constantly. Also, in the wars, actually there needed to be a lot more supplies because, for example, cavalrymen tended to bring at least 2 horses, sometimes up to 4, and actually archers then started to ride horses. And lastly, with more and more weapons needed, as sometimes the English archers would shoot 500,000 arrows in a day. Food was requisitioned through compulsory purchase, known as purveyance. This is supposed to pay a fair price to the owners, and then the supplies were then sent, usually by sea, to supply depots from where the army could be supplied. A royal army was also created at the Tower of London, storing weapons and storing arrows and other equipment for war. Now, a lot of this was carried around through baggage trains, so when on campaign, these baggage trains would follow the army around, which meant actually that the army slowed down and the baggage train required protection, because if it was destroyed, the army would starve. Sometimes these baggage trains were over 100 carts. This constant war had an increased impact on civilians. The increased costs led to increased taxation, greater use of purveyance, and the king started to need to seize ships to transport his army and his supplies around. Now, the increased taxation actually directly led to the Peasants' Revolt in 1381 because of the increase in taxes for the peasants. Civilians also would resist both feudal duties and the assays of arms, forcing them to fight. Many paid scutage to avoid fighting, some just simply deserted at the first opportunity, and some literally refused to join up. Civilians would also suffer during wars, as towns were often raided. As we know, in 1296 the Scottish army raided the north of England, killing and plundering. Goods were plundered, where armies stole supplies and their goods from local towns. Towns were sometimes forced to pay ransoms so that the army would not attack them, and often towns and castles were laid under siege, leading to starvation and death to many civilians. Overall, warfare was very bad for civilians due to sieges, raids, plunder, ransom. However, some could benefit from the war. Soldiers were paid relatively good wages compared to labourers and even master craftsmen. In 1350, during the 100 Years' War, a labourer in England earned about 2p per day, a master craftsman earned 4p a day, but a mounted archer would earn 6p a day. Soldiers could also make extra money from ransoms and plundering, so fighting could offer a good income for civilians. Also, if you're a civilian who made goods needed in wars, such as weapons, clothes, fortifications, armour, carts, etc., it was a time of prosperity. You could make good money selling these to the king. England was at war for most of the period 1250 to 1500. In this time, the size of armies, most weapons and strategy generally remained the same. However, the use of the pike and the longbow changed and reduced the impact and need for the mounted knight, meaning there were a lot less of them. Gunpowder started to be used for cannons and firearms, and is one example of technology changing warfare at this time. Recruitment will broadly stay the same, with feudal service, assays of arms and payment, recruiting troops, though less troops were recruited through feudal service, and actually training of troops improved as more mercenaries were used, but was still often poor. Provisioning changed due to the high amount of war and included purveyance and weapon stores. And civilians mostly suffered through warfare, through increased taxes and requisitioning, though some were able to benefit from improved wages and selling goods to the army.